Picture this. London, September 1992. You're standing outside one of the most powerful financial institutions in the world, the Bank of England, 300 years old, built on stone so thick it survived the Blitz. It financed wars against Napoleon. It managed a currency that once ruled a quarter of the planet. From the outside, it looks completely untouchable.
But inside those walls, on that particular gray September morning, the men running the bank are terrified. Not because of a bomb, not because of an invading army, because of a phone call. A phone call from a hedge fund manager sitting in a glass skyscraper in Manhattan 3,000 miles away, who had just decided to bet $10 billion that the British pound was a lie.
This is the story of Black Wednesday, the greatest financial heist in human history. The day a single trader brought the United Kingdom to its knees and walked away with over $1 billion in profit before dinner.
To understand how this was even possible, you need to understand what Europe was trying to build in the late 1980s. The Cold War was ending. The Berlin Wall had just come down. There was this incredible wave of optimism sweeping across the continent. European leaders looked at each other and said, "We've spent centuries destroying each other. Let's bind ourselves together so tightly that war becomes impossible."
So they created the exchange rate mechanism, the ERM. The idea was elegant in theory. All the major European currencies, the French franc, the Italian lira, the Spanish peseta, and the British pound, would be tied to each other. They would move together, rise and fall together, like a fleet of ships roped to the same anchor. And that anchor was the German mark.
Germany was the economic heavyweight of Europe. Its central bank, the Bundesbank, was legendary for being disciplined, serious, and absolutely ruthless about keeping inflation under control. The Germans had been scarred by the catastrophic hyperinflation of the 1920s, when people needed wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. They never forgot that. So the mark was rock solid, and every other country wanted to borrow that credibility.
Britain joined the ERM in October 1990. Prime Minister John Major was a true believer. He thought pegging the pound to the German mark would finally tame the inflation that had haunted the British economy for decades. The government set the rate at 2.95 German marks to 1 British pound and drew a line in the sand. The pound would never fall below 2.77 marks. That was the promise. That was the commitment. That was the trap. Because here is where the fatal flaw reveals itself. The ERM assumed that all European economies would need the same medicine at the same time. What works for Germany must work for Britain. In theory, it sounds reasonable. In reality, it was a disaster waiting to happen. By 1992, Germany was spending billions rebuilding the devastated infrastructure of East Germany after reunification. To prevent that spending from triggering inflation, the Bundesbank raised interest rates sharply. For Germany, it made complete sense. For Britain, it was economic poison.
Britain was not booming. Britain was in a deep, painful recession. People were losing jobs. Homeowners were drowning in mortgage payments. Businesses were going under. The normal response would be for the Bank of England to cut interest rates, make borrowing cheaper, and breathe life back into the economy. But they couldn't. Because of the ERM, cutting rates would cause investors to dump pounds and buy marks to chase the higher German yields. The pound would fall. And under the rules of the agreement, the pound was forbidden from falling. Britain was trapped, locked inside a cage made of political promises, forced to keep interest rates brutally high while its own economy bled out. And George Soros was watching every single second of it.
Soros was not your typical Wall Street trader. Before he ever touched financial markets, he was a philosophy student. He had survived the Nazi occupation of Hungary as a child and had learned something profound from that experience. Authority figures lie, systems are fragile, and the gap between the official story and reality can become a chasm. He developed a theory he called reflexivity, the idea that markets are not rational machines, they are human. They believe stories, and sometimes those stories drift so far from reality that the whole structure collapses under its own weight. When Soros looked at the British pound in the summer of 1992, he saw exactly that. The official story said the pound was strong, stable, and worth nearly 3 German marks. The reality said Britain was economically crumbling, held together only by interest rates so high they were suffocating the population.
His lead analyst, Stanley Druckenmiller, put it perfectly. He said Britain was like a man holding his breath underwater. He can do it for a while, but eventually he has to come up for air. When Britain finally had to cut rates, the pound would crash. And the beauty of betting against it was that the downside was almost nothing. If Soros was wrong, he would lose a tiny amount on transaction costs. If he was right, he would make a fortune.
It was the closest thing to a free trade that the financial world had ever seen.
The trigger came on September 15th. The president of the Bundesbank gave an interview and casually dropped a hint that some currencies in the ERM might need to be realigned. He didn't say the pound. He didn't have to. Every trader on the planet understood exactly what he meant. The Germans were stepping aside. They would not fight to save the British pound.
When that news hit the wires in New York, Druckenmiller walked into Soros's office and said they should increase their position. At the time, they had about $1.5 billion bet against the pound. He suggested raising it to $3 or $4 billion. Soros looked at him and said something that became one of the most famous lines in financial history.
He said, "If you are right, you cannot be just a little bit right. You have to go for the jugular."
That night, the Quantum Fund went to war. They called banks across the world, borrowing British pounds from anyone willing to lend. British banks, American banks, Japanese banks. Then they immediately sold every single pound for German marks. By the time dawn broke over London on September 16th, a tidal wave of sell orders was locked and loaded. Inside the British Treasury, Chancellor Norman Lamont was woken by a phone call with grim news. The pound was already slipping in Asian markets. He drove to Whitehall in the dark, knowing this would be the ultimate test.
When the London markets opened at 8:30 that morning, the Bank of England came out swinging. They started buying pounds in massive chunks, hundreds of millions at a time, trying to signal strength, trying to scare the market into backing down. Usually, when a central bank steps in, traders hesitate. Nobody wants to pick a fight with a government. But on this morning, the market did not hesitate, not for a single second. For every £1 million the Bank of England bought, the hedge funds sold 2 million. Soros was selling, other funds were selling. Major corporations like Ford and BP, seeing the writing on the wall, started offloading their own pound reserves to protect themselves. It was a complete stampede. By 10 in the morning, the Bank of England was burning through its reserves at a rate that was genuinely terrifying. They escalated. At 10:30, they announced a shock interest rate hike from 10% to 12%. A 2% rise in a single morning, unheard of. In normal circumstances, that would send the currency soaring. The market laughed. Traders didn't see strength, they saw panic. They knew that homeowners already struggling at 10% would be absolutely crushed at 12%. They knew the government couldn't sustain it.
So instead of buying pounds, they sold even more. Soros saw the rate hike and smiled. When a government does something that extreme and the market ignores it, he knew, the game was already over. The British government had one card left: the nuclear option. At 2:15 in the afternoon, the Bank of England announced a second rate hike, from 12% to 15%. 15%. A number that would have meant bankruptcy for millions of British homeowners if it stuck for more than a few weeks. It was the most desperate bluff in modern financial history.
The market called it immediately.
By early evening, it was finished. The Bank of England had spent over £3 billion of taxpayers' money. It was gone, transferred directly into the accounts of Soros and the other funds. John Major gathered his senior ministers. They agreed to pull Britain out of the ERM entirely and let the pound float freely, which meant letting it crash. At 7:30 that evening, a pale and shaken Norman Lamont stood before the cameras and announced Britain's surrender. In New York, Soros stopped trading and began counting his profits. Over $1 billion in a single day. Here is the twist that most people never hear about. In the months that followed Black Wednesday, the British economy did not collapse. It recovered. Without the ERM straitjacket, interest rates were slashed from 15% down to 6%. Homeowners exhaled. Businesses started borrowing again. The weaker pound made British exports competitive around the world. The economy grew rapidly. Many economists now argue that Black Wednesday was actually the best thing that ever happened to Britain.
It freed the country from a policy that was destroying it. And the long shadow of that day stretched further than anyone expected. When Europe began building the euro a decade later, Britain stood back. The trauma of Black Wednesday was still too raw. They had seen what happens when you surrender control of your interest rates to serve someone else's needs. Britain kept the pound. And keeping the pound meant that when Brexit happened in 2016, it was actually possible. If Britain had been inside the euro, leaving the EU would have been unthinkable.
One trade, one man, one Wednesday in September, and the entire trajectory of a nation changed forever.
The Bank of England still stands on Threadneedle Street, solid as ever, but something invisible was lost that day. The illusion that governments control markets, the belief that political will can override economic reality. Soros didn't just break a bank, he ended an era. If this story gripped you the way it grips me, subscribe right now. Every week we go deep into the hidden turning points that shaped the world we live in, the moments the textbooks summarize in a paragraph but deserve an entire story. Hit the bell so you never miss one. The history most people were never taught is exactly what we cover here, and we are just getting started.